Hi, everyone. I'm Kevin.
Hey, and I'm Mark.
Okay, then I'll be in May. Thank you so much for joining us today at a very brave space to Peace Bridges. And we're going to address some very uncomfortable conversation. So, welcome aboard. This morning, let's set the intention first that everything we do here today is for the greatest and highest good of all concerned. That we respect our ancestors, those who have come before us, the spirits of our nations, and the indigenous peoples of our world. We thank them for their courage, their bravery, and for leading the way to where we are going today. Thank you, everyone.
Ashe. Ashe.
Thanks, Emma.
Ashe. Yes, thank you. Welcome to Detangling Perspectives. I'm your host, Kevin Baker. Are you ready to engage in meaningful healing work, both inside and out? This is an invitation to slow down, to breathe, and look inward. We will explore socialization, history, family, culture, and how they have shaped us, and how we can rewrite those stories with empathy, responsibility, and courage. This is not about blame or perfection. It's about becoming more human together. So wherever you are in your journey, I'm glad you're here. Welcome again to Detangling Perspectives. Let's begin.
Drop.
So
Well,
what's on the table? What's on?
I don't know if you guys have a meditation to start your day, but holy cannolis, I'm going to share what happened this morning at 8:20.
Yeah, please.
Mark's ancestors, Kevin's ancestors, and my ancestors came in my meditation today. And it was the most beautiful swirl, this minestrone soup, this sushi a la carte, this red beans and rice, and it was all together, and we were having a joyful conversation. But suddenly they broke out in voice, together, and they said the word unity and continued to say the word unity. Now, I don't have these kind of meditations every day. This is pretty huge for me. And they said collectively that if we do not take care of our humanity, we will destroy each other. It nearly brought me to tears. It nearly brought me to a place that said, what are we doing to each other? What are we doing? After thousands of years of humanity, this is what we do to each other? I couldn't take a breath. In that moment, I just held fast to the idea that here we are this morning talking about very sensitive issues. And we're going to pick up the topic of racism and prejudice. So Kevin.
Yes, thank you.
Please guide us here.
Thank you, May, for that. And that is profound, and a profound message to receive, from our ancestors. And we have to honor them and know and understand that they come to help guide us, in our journeys. And so that is absolutely wonderful to hear. And I think it really speaks to the work that the three of us have gathered to do, right? Which is having a cross-cultural conversation to talk about some issues that are really plaguing, is the word that comes to mind, humanity. And how do we begin to work with it? I was watching this segment this morning and on policing in America, and it really struck me that there is so much work to do and so many different worldviews on how policing is approached. And with that, there are also so many worldviews in the way that humanity has dealt with the ills that has happened to us, right? When I think about, Mark, and your Jewish heritage, and, remembering the tragedy of the Holocaust, and what happened there during that period of time, and the strides that have been made since then, right? And how, I know some other Jewish friends that I have, and I don't remember if you said, I don't know if I've heard you say it or not, but I know that a lot of Jewish people will say, never forget, right? Never forget what has happened. And then when I reflect back on the African Holocaust, right, where for hundreds of years, millions upon millions of Africans were taken out of Africa, were kidnapped, right, killed on the continent, on the journey to the coast, killed in the Middle Passage on the way here to the Americas, South America, Central America, North America, and then those that also died and continue to die, in this country because of race, and America's inability to deal with race and racism and what that means in our society, right? So it really began in this hemisphere over 500 years ago. Oftentimes we hear the 1619 date, which is really British enslavement, right? But the Spaniards landed in this hemisphere with enslaved Africans 500 years ago, right? And of course, we're using round numbers and all of that. But and part of the doctrine that came out of the papal bulls, which said that it was okay for white European to come and do this and to go forth in the world and conquer, has really set up a system of white privilege, racism, and feelings of superiority and inferiority in our world. And that's what we aren't dealing with, right? So when we think of the term, so we hear terms like racist, right? Which is really a charged term. And part of the issue of dealing with that is that most people believe that they are ethical. But majority of people believe that they're ethical, right? And when we center that on race, right? When I'm talking to groups, and especially groups of white people, and I said, how many of you believe that you're ethical? All of the hands go up, right? Then I asked, how many of you believe that you are good? All of the hands go up, right? And then it's like, how many of you also believe and understand that you're racist? And it's like no hands go. Well, a few will go up because they understand, right?
Oh, Mark, talk about that.
Well, I mean, come on, Kevin. I understand, most white people, of course, we don't believe we're racist. Now, I can't speak for all white people, but many of the white people I know, it's like, no, racists are, the guy waving the Confederate flag on the state Capitol lawn, or the crazy guy with the horns who busts into the Capitol on January. Those are racists, or, that kind of, no, that, I'm a white liberal, that I'm not a racist. And I think the greatest kind of red pill, blue pill kind of, that moment from the Matrix, for white people really happened in the last year or two, when we're sort of realizing, holy shit, there's a difference between individual people being racist and having institutionalized racism that reinforces these things, that keeps people of color in this country down, and has been doing so for decade after decade, century after century. And I think you mentioned, my Jewish heritage, having been raised Jewish, when I finally learned about what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, 100 years ago, immediately my thoughts were about the liquidation of the Krakow and the the ghettos in
Right.
Poland by the Nazis, right? By the Warsaw and the Krakow ghettos. But the thing is that the Nazis got taken to task for it. They got their butts kicked, not necessarily specifically because because of the Holocaust, but of course, but at least there was comeuppance, right? There is no more Nazism other than fringe wackos in the world today. But to think that not a single person paid there were no consequences for the people who committed that act. I think if I think back to that makes me think about the pogroms that took place in Russia, for example, at the turn of the century, which my grandfather escaped Russia in order to escape those pogroms. There was no comeuppance until the Bolsheviks showed up and replaced the Tsar, but that was hardly a good replacement. So it's only now that I think, even in my own experience, that white people that I know even have a frame of reference to try and understand this kind of institutionalized racism versus the wacko with the Confederate flag or or the Holocaust denier or somebody like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much for adding that, because that's the thing, right? We all believe that we're ethical and good, so therefore I'm not participating in these systems, right? And when we tend to use the word racist, what happens is people have this picture, like you said, of the folks who are, the insurrection in the Capitol, and and skinheads and all of that, right? That's the picture that comes to mind. No one looks in the mirror and says, oh, I'm a racist, right? Which brings up the thought about prejudice, right? Because, there's a belief that everyone can be racist, right? And the elements that go into racist is power or privilege, white privilege plus power, right? White privilege plus power. And there's only one group in America that fits both of those categories, right? And that's white folks, right? And it's a hard pill to swallow. And I believe that is one of the biggest things that's holding us up and having these conversations, right? Because the minute that you use racist, what tends to happen is emotions go up, ears cut off, hearts cut off, right? And then from that point on, it's like it's no conversation, right? Now, all of us can be prejudiced, and all of us are prejudiced. We have our own prejudices around different issues. But the key element there is the power to impact someone else's life, right? Social or institutional power, right? And there's a difference. So there's when you talk about social and institutional power, you're talking about a group or groups that hold power on the institutional level. Now, I can be, Mark, if I was your supervisor, right, at work, then I would hold positional power, right, where I can impact your life at work. But if we both walked outside and you slapped me, Mark, right, and I called the police, when the police arrive, they're going to ask Mark what happened. They're not going to ask me what happened. And that's based on whiteness, right? And that's that institutional power. The greatest example we had of that was, Amy, that was in Central Park when, she called the police on the Black man who was bird watching, right? Well, she believed that the police were there to protect her. Mm-hmm. Right. And she exercised institutional power. The only reason that the Black man there did not get arrested was because of the fact that he pulled out his phone and he began to film. Mm-hmm. Right. If he had not done that, he would have been arrested. And I did hear a few prosecutors say that they have used 911 calls like that to prove their case, right? And we saw that, Amy could get an Emmy for her performance that day, right? So just wanting to bring the distinction between prejudice and racist. And the fact is, I want to introduce another word, racialization, because sometimes that's easier for people to hear and to understand and to grab hold of. And to say that we live in a racialized society that impacts us all, right? That's easier and tends to go over easier than using the word racist, right? So the understanding the racialization of our society and the fact that there is no aspect of our society, of the American society, and some would say all over the world, that racialization has not impacted.
What do you think?
I'm gonna tease that a little bit, because racialized society, that just gave me a rash. Perhaps I would like to call it hereditary hostage, in that we have listened and heard and seen and watched and believed our predecessors of life have taught us something, maybe taught us something good or wrong or right. But whatever we have as information now is our own information. And the sad part is we don't update our own information. And a lot of this is ancient and old, and I call it hereditary, because the history books are written by white men. And what we learned in school, what I learned in elementary school,
absolutely,
is so contrary to what is being spoken today.
Absolutely. And, and like you said, our book, our text, all of us that have gone through everyone, in America has gone through the school system, and what we've learned has come from white men. And when are we going to say, okay, there are other points of view out there that we need to look at, right? When are we going to look at that and say, there's a larger world, right? There are other aspects. How do we begin to bring one down and elevate others so that we're all on the same playing field? Mark, I see you want to get in here.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I'm just thinking about some of my white friends that we went through this, we're in a post-racial society because we had a Black president, and, there's Black mayors and there's Black governors, or, and there's Black people in the Senate, and, that it's post-racial. Why do people keep bringing up race? Doesn't help. That's what people, when I talk to white friends of mine, that's the kind of stuff I often hear.
Right. And that's why it's even more important to accept that we live in a racialized society, right? And that race impacts it, because race and racism started in America before America was America, right? America became America in 1776? But we know that just a baby, that the Spaniards landed in the Santo Domingo 500 years ago, and in Florida, I don't know, somewhere 450 years ago, something like that, right? Bringing enslaved Africans. And then 419, 1619 is the date that British enslavement started in this country. In every aspect, laws have been created, to govern how we are. And that happened then, and it's happening now. When we look at the voting rights issue, part of the reason that the election went the way that it did was because Black folks and other people of color got out and voted. And the Republican Party is working very hard now to push all of the voting rights back. I mean, to think in Atlanta that we have it so good here in Washington where, we've been voting by mail for at least the past 10, 12 years.
Yeah.
No, at least 12 years since I've been here, right? 12, 13 years. And, so it's great. You get your ballot, you fill it out, and you go to the poll box and you drop it in, and someone comes and picks it up, right? And to imagine back home where I'm from, people are still getting up and going out to a poll and having to have to wait and stand in line.
Mhm.
And they've narrowed the number of polling places so much that people are in line. I think this past the election cycle in Georgia, people were in line 6-8 hours, if not more than that. And that's ridiculous.
It's terrible. It's terrible. And Joe Manchin, if you're listening, you should be voting for that voting rights, that national voting rights bill. So try and reverse some of this crazy shit that's going on in the States. I mean, it's bald face, you know, in places like Texas and Georgia and Florida. I mean, if
Right.
as a person who's worked as a poll watcher and as an election judge in the great city of Chicago, in the old Daily Machine, when I was a kid, when I was just old enough to vote, the idea that you couldn't give people water, that you couldn't in any way support them for coming out, let alone give them the day off. If you won't let them vote by mail, at least give them the day off to vote if they're going to have to stand there. But there's no reason in modern society why anyone should have to stand in line for more than 30 minutes to vote. That's intentional, you know, voter suppression in my mind. It's intentional voter suppression.
Absolutely. It's a shame. It's a shame. And May, what are your thoughts about that?
Kevin, do you think there's even a possibility of breaking down institutional racism? And where does it begin?
You know, institutions are made up of people. And people have to be willing to do their personal work for change to occur. But oftentimes people see this institution or systems as something outside of themselves and don't see their participation in it. You know, when someone says, oh, well, that's what the policy says, you know, oh, that's how we've always done it, right? When people say those things, they are really becoming a bystander and saying that I'm just going to let it happen, right? But the other part, well, not but, because I don't like using the word but, and the other part is that for some who have institutional power, for white people who have institutional power, these policies, these practices are of benefit to them, right? There's a book out, and I can't think of the author's name, but what's the title? It's called White Rage. And basically what it says is that when BIPOC folks have issues, that we go out and we will destroy property. We will protest, we will destroy property, we will do all of that. And that when white people are enraged, they will change policy.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think January 6th proved that, you know, there's plenty of crazy white people. So, you know.
Absolutely, but you just talked about the mark.
I think you got to look at it from two different ways, right? They're the people who hold the power, the white people who hold the power, and the white people who are afraid that black people will take, or people of color will take away what little they actually have left of the American dream. Those are the people that I think were so amenable to the message of Donald Trump and the Republican Party. So, you know, Jeff Bezos is not worried about you taking his shit away. You can't get close to Jeff Bezos. You know what I mean? I can't get close to Jeff Bezos unless he calls me. You know what I mean? That's not happening. But, you know, it's when you're 1 or 2 paychecks away from losing your place and you're afraid that some black guy or some immigrant is going to take your job, you know, then you're easy pickings. Racism is an excellent card to play. And it has always it's unfortunate because I'm a person who's been involved in the labor movement, having been in several unions, but unions were used as a way of keeping black people out of professions, out of certain, you know, jobs and so on. And so it's this whole idea of like, this is to end May's point, if I was to, you know, suggest something, it's the fundamental mindset of limitation, that there's only so much to go around. And so if the white people who have the power don't hold on to it, grab it and hold on tight to it, then the black people are going to take it away and there won't be any left for us. And the three of us are believers in this infinite, you know, fundamental infiniteness of everything. In other words, of of money, of resources, of the renewability of resource, right? And the fact that you can create money out of thin air, you can create resources out of thin air, as we are now doing in many ways, energy from the sun and from the wind. And so this idea, this zero-sum game, that if Kevin and I have to compete on a level playing field, I'm the one who's going to get screwed. No, you're going to get screwed. That's an absolute lose-lose proposition every single time. Every single time.
I totally agree. Well said.
Then we have to do our part as part of humanity in micro advocacy. Mark, you've used this terminology many times about making change and being an instrument of change, even in the smallest possible way. If you see something wrong, say something. If you feel something wrong, feel it back. I've been accosted many times these last 6, 7, 8, and well, maybe a whole fucking year. I have been accosted.
Tell everybody what happened when you were at Costco, and then the other time when you were in the parking lot of it. I know it's painful, but
Yeah, it was right during the toilet paper siege, and I was in a Costco when a white gentleman with a shopping cart full of diapers started yelling at me because I coughed. And he said, "Go fucking home. What the hell do you think you're doing here? Did you bring this disease here?" He had a rant, and I grabbed a hold of his cart while I was looking at the one package of toilet paper that was left. I grabbed hold of his cart and I said, "Excuse me, sir. I know you're scared. I know you're frightened. And obviously from the diapers in your cart, you have little children at home. But I would ask you to practice compassion now." You probably said what you said just out of fear, out of being scared of what's going to happen next. I assure you, sir, I did not make this disease come here all by myself. I looked a little Asian, yes. And this is times when we don't have a mask on. I kind of enjoyed the mask. But this was his fear. There were 6, 7 people surrounding us by this time. I know they've got their cameras out. And I simply asked this guy, almost at a whisper, to practice compassion. He was shaking because his hands were on his cart and he was shaking. I could feel it. And he apologized in a whisper. He said, "I'm sorry. I'm really sorry." I said, "Thank you. Now I don't have to withdraw your Costco card, you fucker."
And May,
But this is something that I understand. I practice as much as possible compassion and understand both sides. And that's part of setting up a peace bridge in that we can meet someplace by conversation, by approaching each other, not through hatred or not through being accosted, but for bringing our heritage together and making soup.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that story. That your experience of what has happened. My wife and I was talking last night about objective versus subjective realities. And one of the things that I teach is that a part of whiteness is saying that everything that is outside of myself is subjective and only my experience is objective. So therefore, whatever experience someone else has, if it's not my experience, it is not real, right? And what we have to do is to make space to understand that everyone's reality is objective and is their reality. Right now, we have 3 objective realities on this call, right, on this podcast, and the only one that is not subjective to me is my own. And I have to make room and understand that you all's experience is real, is valid, and I can't tell you about your experience. The only thing I can do is believe your experience, right? But we talk about systems that perpetuate and set up white supremacy culture or white normative behaviors that we then live by. I'm going to read a little passage out of a book called Understanding an Afrocentric Worldview, an Introduction to Optimal Psychology by Dr. Linda James Myers. And in this section, she says, I reasoned that a society that perpetuates racism and sexism to the point of institutionalization is teaching its adherents to think in very limited, superficial manners, suboptimal, to say the least. The logical outcome of such systems has to be fear, insecurity, anxiety, and so on in every social institution. And that's what you was just talking about, right? Fear. Our society has bred fear all over the place, right? Everything is about fear. The fear that someone is going to take something from me, the fear that someone is going to do something to me, the fear, and it is always outside of ourselves, right? Outside of me. But how do we get to this mindset of abundance to know that the universe is going to take care of us all, right? And it's really about how we show up with each other.
Yeah, I mean, I want to, and may I, again, I'm not here to represent all white people, and there are a lot of freaking stupid white people, and it.
My husband's white. Hey,
I know,
what's it?
I know, and when the guy says, go back where you came from, what, Encino? I mean, like,
I know.
WTF here, come on. But you have, as you know, I'm a longtime practicing Buddhist, and the contemporary Buddhist philosopher Ikeda has talked a lot about this idea of imaginative empathy. In other words, the ability to have empathy for people who are, as Kevin says, are outside of our own experience. And so instead of just accepting this line of especially white people get so easily influenced, and of course, I have to question my own assumptions, or I wouldn't be having these conversations with the two of you. So I mean, this whole idea of reflection, self-reflection, it's sort of like this idea, as Kevin says, like if you're Black in America, every day you wake up knowing you're Black in America, and then society is there to pound that realization into you and limits. But I wake up every day in America and I don't think I'm white. I don't think, I gotta wear this white suit today, but the only the only metaphor, well, not metaphor, but the historical analogy that I have, of course, going back to the Jewish tradition, is during the Nazi era, before the Holocaust, when Jews were still allowed in society, but had to wear these stars, right, before, and in all the occupied territories. So even though you might look the same, the moment they saw that star, then immediately, you have a caste system, all these other things come into play. And so despite the fact that those people were neighbors and were in many cases coworkers and friends and so on, the moment those stars went on and the value system shifted, then, this kind of creating pariahs and having a caste system, it's the only kind of historical analogy that I can, put on to try and understand what it must be like to be Black in America, because I'm never going to know what it's like to be a Black person in America any more than I'm going to know what it's going to be like, what it's like to be a half Japanese, half Chinese, intuitive woman from Encino.
With 11% Korean, don't forget that.
Yes, man. I forgot.
That's a new piece in the quote.
Right, a new piece in the puzzle, right? And thank you, Mark, and thank you. And man, I want to take this opportunity to say that, that we have tremendous empathy with our Asian brothers and sisters, right? Our Asian Pacific Islander brothers and sisters who have been under attack the past year based on nitwits, saying stuff and making comments that was just adding fuel to the fire, or not even adding fuel, creating the fire, right, of the surge in Asian hate crime, right, that has happened. So our compassion and empathy goes out to our Asian Pacific Islander brothers and sisters out there, and those who have also lost their lives. So I want to make that crystal clear. And and then let's talk a little bit about how the impacts of all of this on community and this awakening that is also happening in the Asian community, right? Because I have other Asian friends who will say, wow, I'm beginning to feel and understand what's it like to be Black in America and to live under this threat, right? And I think that's powerful and good. And how do we increase the cross-cultural understanding and empathy so that we can stay together and not begin to go into what we call the oppression Olympics, right? Where one begins to say that I'm more oppressed than the other, right? How do we do that?
Yeah, well, I think go ahead, May. You want to say something? I hear you. I can see.
Kevin, actually, you taught me the terminology of being the compliant immigrant and the non-compliant immigrant, in which my father was one of those compliant immigrants coming from Beijing, China. He luckily found a job with a French photographer because he happened to speak 3 or 4 different languages and was able to leave China on the Queen Mary, to the United States, then to the Queen Mary out of Europe. Don't ask me, it's a long freaking story. But he was graced with the opportunities of traveling the world and seeing other cultures, other styles of life, and said, I want that, and had the opportunity to come to the United States, where a senator and 6 other white American men helped my father land his green card and build the first Chinese takeout restaurant in the San Fernando Valley. There's the non-compliant, the one who may have been forced to come to the United States out of war or famine or any other condition. And that is the same condition as being enslaved, as they had to be forced to come due to being kidnapped, due to being the color of their skin. So when you say to imagine empathy, I feel deeply, as an intuitive, I feel deeply for our heritage, our ancestors, and how much they've brought with them this amazing story behind each person, whether you are white or Black or a sort of yellows. The point is, I think we all have a beautiful story. And if we started to respect each other's stories and gave more compassion to these stories, we would find our humanity. We would find that opportunity of knowing one another, not just by the way you cook your potatoes or your rice. It's how we live a life together. So my feeling is that we would have to encourage as much as possible communication, and to have these rough conversations with a little dash of humor and understanding. Mark, we came from the same deli in Hollywood, Cantor's Deli. And it's amazing that we ended up here in Washington State together and enjoying this wonderful friendship, and Kevin also. So look at that, just the magic of the 3 of us coming together. I think it can happen worldwide. It's a global friendship. I think that it can happen.
Absolutely.
I have faith.
I have faith as well, right? We just have to be willing to have these hard, tough conversations, right? And then begin to work the personal, right? And not have the personal work us, right? And what's the difference? You know, oh, I was offended by what was said. Oh, they called me a racist. Oh, they did this, right? So that's the personal work in you, right? Whereas when you say, was it something in what was said that I need to examine about myself, right? Could it be true, right? How do I begin a self-reflective process to say that, let me think about that. Let me examine that, right? So that I can begin to work the personal so that I can be on a continuous path of self-improvement, right? And I think that that's part of the issue. Again, you know, doing that personal work. There isn't a presentation that I do or a conversation that I have that I don't talk about the need for personal work, right? We all have to do our work, right? That self-reflective work to think about, how am I showing up in the world, right? Did I do anything to cause harm? How do I make up for that? How do I, because karma is real, right?
Oh, yeah.
And then how do we help people also deal with the traumas that they have experienced, right? We live today in a quote unquote cancel culture, right? Where someone who has experienced trauma, something happens to them, right? Or they hear something and they are triggered. And then it's not about the person who may have caused that trauma, it's about whoever is sitting in front of them first, right? How do we begin to say we need to nip that in the bud and begin to say, how do we deal with and heal the traumas that people have experienced, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, I want to share some too, because, you know, you talk about the racialization and everything. I think that, you know, emotion, right? Emotion is a signal, right? Emotion is telling us something's going on. It is in itself, it may or may not be real, or it's real, but it may or may not be true, but it's definitely real in that moment. And so when I think about like what, you know, like a wise Buddhist once said to me that the role of children is to cause their parents to do their human revolution. In other words, to do their internal change. And so, you know, anyone who's had kids knows that kids push your buttons, and the buttons they push are not necessarily the button that button's in me. And that button might be something my parent did, my mom or dad did, or my grandparent did to me. But now suddenly I'm about to take it out on my own kid. And I think that a lot of times, you know, when parents become truly reflective, they realize that this whole thing about having kids is not only about raising the next generation, but it's also about the self-reflection about who we are and who we have to be or become in order to be good parents, right? But the thing is that when we talk about race, the same thing is happening, right? In other words, Kevin says something and I go, he's an angry black guy, you know, and then, but where did that come from? Kevin might have a legitimate reason. He might have got ripped off or mistreated or, you know, passed over for promotion. But what that's triggering in me, that button is me, in me. And it's some conditioning. Maybe in this case, it is also from my parents. Maybe there was, you know, racism passed through, which there was certainly in our, you know, in our family and in many families. And maybe it could be societal or cultural as well. But what I think Kevin is talking about, I think rings for me that when I think about it, how would I react if this person was a member of my family triggering me in this way versus how do I react simply because of the color of your skin? Then I have wait a minute. I have to go to wait a minute. Hold on. You know, time out. What's going on? So I think that we are in our society, we are way too indexed towards immediate response to emotion. So we have this emotional response, and then whether it's white fragility or anger or betrayal or whatever it is, like instead of thinking like, what is this emotion telling me? Is the emotion actually being caused by this person in front of me? And to what extent? Maybe it's only 10%, 15% actually, but what they did. But what is it in me that is being triggered that I need to go, hold on, what's going on here?
Absolutely.
And then maybe, just maybe, there's a little room for that imaginative empathy, which is what happens in families, right? When a parent screams at their kid because I had a lousy day, at work and I come home, my kid spilled something on the couch and I scream at the kid. How much percentage of that is really that I'm angry at my kid? The couch is just a freaking piece of furniture. But no, I'm pissed off at my boss or my coworkers or whatever. And so, but yet now my kid is being impacted by this. And the moment I do that, I go, wait a minute, was that appropriate? Should I have done that? And if I'm able to do that, then I can sometimes unwind it. But if I don't, then I'm just going to continue this whole cycle. Now, this is an imperfect analogy because I just made it up and I haven't thought it through, so I have to be careful. But at least it popped into my head when we were talking. And I wonder if it holds any water or not for either of you.
I love it. I love that story because if I took that guy in Costco, yeah, I could have punched him in the throat. Would that get us anywhere? I'd lose my Costco card. And I had no intention of doing that. But rather, we had a conversation almost at a whisper. Almost at a whisper. I had to hear what pain he was feeling first. It was to remove my emotion, but rather look at his and look at what was firing his emotion. The diapers in his basket were my dead giveaway, that he was scared for his children. And just being the protective dad that this bear of a man was feeling, I could feel empathy. I could feel his empathy. So in that moment, I had to strip down mine, that desire to punch him in the throat, and look at his and say, I'm sorry you are so full of fear. I'm sorry you feel like I brought this disease here. And we had a different outcome. So, Mark, when you say that the index was way too high on emotion, there are 30,000 emotions. We usually function on about 20 to 30 emotions a day. But because of heightened conditions in our political scheme, in our global environment, in our health, a little pandemic, we're messed up. And everyone is at a heightened state.
And thank you for this. In depth psychology, there's something called cultural complexes, right? So whenever you talk about culture, then your complexes, which is highly charged emotions, kick up, right? And one of the things that we know is that when your emotions kick up, the first thing that cuts off is your ears, right? The second thing that cuts off is your heart. And the object is to recognize that, right? What I have some colleagues call the leadership of self, right? Recognize that so you can understand and begin to distinguish what's going on around you, right? What am I seeing? What am I hearing? What am I feeling? Right? What am I thinking? Right? And begin to tease all of that out to make those determinations of, in that millisecond that you just talked about and made, that millisecond of how am I going to show up and deal with this situation, right? And Mark, you talked about power dynamics, right? There's a lot of powering over, which we see in this very hierarchical system that we're in, where people will power over others. And there's also a concept of shared power, right? Where we share power with each other. There's also this concept of inner power, right? Where I have the inner ability to do things on my own, my self-efficacy and how I show up in the world and the power that I have to do things, right? And we really have to examine all of those different forms of power and see how does that play in on how we deal with oppression, how we oppress others, and how we come up out of oppression, right? That is so important that we unpack that and deal with it.
We've talked about some heavy, heavy conversation here today, and through across several different terminologies that I hope everybody will take and go home and think about. Oppression Olympics, hereditary hostage, racialized society, and imagine empathy. I want to thank India Ari for the use of her song, What If? And everyone should download her beautiful album called Worthy. She's a dear friend, a client, and somebody that you want to get to know. Kevin Baker, thank you so much for today's conversation. Mark Sacknoff, thank you so much. We've had a great time coming to the Peace Bridge. And though maybe that is very hard to reach, we are taking our micro advocacy steps towards that, and for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. And see you next time. We got more coming. Yes, we do. Drop.